Holland, February 1945. On the threshold of victory in Europe, the Allies prepare for the final mass offensive that will carry them across the Rhine and into the heart of Hitler's Germany. Among the forces under Montgomery are two historic Canadian regiments that will distinguish themselves in the days ahead: the Queen's Own Rifles and the 1st Hussars of Canada. Tonight, a story of personal heroism from the bloody battles that followed as Panorama presents the legend of Aubrey Cosens, B.C. The action for which Sergeant Aubrey Cosens won the Victoria Cross on February 26, 1945, will be remembered not only for his individual bravery, but also as one of the finest achievements in the proud histories of two Canadian regiments. The first was Cosens' own unit, the Queen's Own Rifles. Founded in Toronto on April 26, 1860, the regiment was then known as 2nd Battalion Volunteer Militia Rifles of Canada. 3 years later, the present name was adopted. The regiment saw action before the turn of the century in the Fenian Raids, the Northwest Rebellion, and the South African War of 1899. With a distinguished combat record in World War I, the unit was mobilized again in 1940 as part of the 3rd Canadian Division and landed on Juno Beach on D-Day as one of the Allied assault battalions. In the hard-fought campaign that followed, the Queen's Own Rifles took part in the historic battles of Quinzay Wood and Calais before entering Holland as part of the Allied force which would attack Hitler's last stronghold west of the Rhine. Fighting side by side with the Queen's Own Rifles in the Battle of the Rhineland were the 1st Hussars, a London regiment whose history as a fighting unit dates back to 1856. With a distinguished combat record earned during the First World War as a cavalry regiment, the Hussars converted to an armored unit in 1939 as part of the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade. From the bloody beaches of Normandy, the Hussars fought their way through France in the historic battles of Caen and Falaise and helped to silence forever the German Channel guns at Calais, which had terrorized the British coastline for more than 4 years. From here, the Hussars pushed inland through Belgium to Brussels and on to Breda in southern Holland, where the regiment came under the command of the 2nd Infantry Division. As the momentous year of 1944 drew to a close, the Hussars began intensive training for the long-awaited push to the Rhine. Throughout Holland, the Allies prepare for the all-out offensive that will carry them across the Rhine and into Germany. By land, sea, and air, millions of tons of supplies pour into Holland. Across bridgeless rivers and flooded plains left behind by the retreating Germans, the lifeline of supplies that will feed the front begins to inch forward. On the 8th of February 1945, the first wave of the offensive is launched. More than 400 heavies of Bomber Command descend on the enemy strongholds of Cleve and Gotch to begin the softening up process that will precede the attack. Another 95 bombers of the RAF pound the enemy positions at Uden and Kalkar with more than 400 tons of bombs. 1,000 heavy guns of the Allied forces and a battery of Canadian rocket launchers begin a barrage on the last German positions west of the Rhine. The concentration of fire which falls on the German 84th Division in a single day exceeds that on any similar front during the entire Western campaign. The attack begins, but the enemy is stubborn. For 12 days, Allied progress is slowed by flood-swollen rivers and bitter German resistance. The Fuhrer has given explicit orders that each foot of hard-won soil be defended to the death. By February 20th, the 1st Canadian Army has hacked and clawed its way less than 20 miles forward of the start line. The Rhine still lies ahead. To reach it, the Canadians must cross the horseshoe-shaped escarpment which curves southward from Calcar to Eugene. Then on the evening of February 25th, the Canadian forces are regrouped in the muddy fields southwest of Calcar under heavy enemy fire. At 4:30 the next morning, the Queen's Own Rifles, together with Sherman tank squadrons of the 1st Hussars, begin to move out under a covering fire of artillery. As the right flank of the 3rd Infantry Division's assault, their immediate objectives are the villages of Stieg and Wimmerschaft. Fighting alongside them are battalions of the 8th Infantry Brigade and the North Shore Regiment. From splintered tree to upturned cart to sagging farmhouse wall, men of the Queen's Own crawl and wriggle forward under a blanket of enemy fire. Among their number is a 23-year-old native of Northern Ontario who in hours ahead will achieve a moment of glory and die in the service of his country. In a moment, the events which led to the legend of Aubrey Cosens. In the hard-fought battle that followed, number 16 platoon of Company D Queen's Own Rifles led the advance on the extreme left of the battalion. Its objective was a heavily defended group of 3 farm buildings on a narrow secondary road. The fight was short but sharp, and the platoon soon occupied the buildings. But the retreating enemy launched a counterattack under a devastating barrage of German artillery fire. Canadian casualties were heavy, but the platoon, with the support of a single Hussar tank, fought back valiantly. In the withdrawal that followed, platoon leader Lieutenant L.C. McKay was gravely wounded. Sergeant Aubrey Cosens took immediate charge of the shocked survivors while the Germans reoccupied the buildings vacated by 16 Platoon. It was then that Cosens unfolded a daring plan of attack and put it into action. Leaping onto a tank commanded by Sergeant C.R. Anderson of the 1st Hussars, Cosens directed it to crash through the rear wall of the farmhouse while he distracted the German gunners inside by running across an open field. While the Germans did their best to gun him down, the Sherman crashed through the wall. While the bricks were still falling, Cosens plunged forward and disappeared through the hole. Taking the Germans completely by surprise, Cosens raced from room to room, killing or wounding its occupants. After clearing the main farmhouse, he charged the 2nd and 3rd buildings alone, routing the defendants despite a hail of machine gun and rifle fire. When his savage assault was over, Sergeant Cosens had killed 20 enemy soldiers and captured another 20. Then, after deploying his men to deal with further counterattacks, he left to report to his company commander. On the way, he was shot in the head by a German sniper. He died instantly. He was only 23. "20 years later, 2 men walked through London's Victoria Park toward the famous Holy Roller, the Sherman tank that fought its way unscathed through the entire Western campaign. As crew commander and driver of a similar Hussar tank that fought its way toward the Rhine on that day in 1945, they have come to recall the legend of Aubrey Cosens. The crew commander is former Sergeant Charles Anderson. The driver, former Hussar trooper Bill Adams.
Well, as I recall, we pushed off about 4:30 in the morning, and our regiment was the 1st Hussars, who were equipped with tanks such as this, the Sherman tanks. Perhaps Bill Adams, who was my driver on this particular day, can describe the Sherman tank for you.
Well, thanks, Charlie. This Sherman tank here had a crew of 5 with 2 drivers, a crew commander, wireless operator, and gunner. This tank here weighs roughly 30 tons. They are usually equipped with twin diesels, which give you lots of power. On a good road, you could probably do 30 miles an hour. Also, this tank here is the Holy Roller. which went in D-Day, and it was the only one that went right through to the hostilities in Europe were finished.
We took up a position beside the farmhouse where the infantry is being pinned down by Germans concealed in the farmhouse. And while we were sitting there, Sergeant Cosens came over and climbed up on the back of the tank and up to the turret and stood beside me. And he explained what he wanted to do. And he guided us around to the side of the house where he wanted to go through the wall. And we took up a position there until he got into position himself. And when he took up his position, my driver here now could probably tell you what took place.
We were roughly 20 yards from the building. It was all open country. There were not any place to get shelter. So when we made the run, I would be traveling, I would say 10 to 15 miles an hour. By the time I got to the building and hit it, I had slowed down, which probably I was doing 5 miles an hour. The land, there was one spot there. There must have been a small gully or a hill of some kind, because as we were traveling there, the tank just about tipped over on us, but it righted itself up, and I advanced to get a good shot trying to go through this wall. When I first tried it, I didn't do much good. I bounced back from it. So I put the tank in bull low, which is a very low gear with lots of power, and I tried again, and I made a hole through the building. I went in roughly probably 3-4 feet, but I didn't want to go any farther in case there was a basement in there and we would all go through. So I backed out, and we went around to the front of the building. You remember that, Charlie, when we went around to the...
We went around to the front of the building, and we thought it would be a good idea to get the Jerry's out of there in a hurry, so we lobbed in 2 HE shells into the window and door, and then we waited for a while, and shortly the Jerry's started to come out with their hands up, and our infantry took over and took them prisoner. And after the prisoners had come out of the farmhouse, we went back to another house to the rear, which I believe was the company headquarters, and I met a Major Dunkelman there who was in charge of the Queen's Own company, and at that time he had asked me to make out a report on the action that had taken place and what part Sergeant Cosens had played in the action.
A few weeks ago, 2 other men who remember Aubrey Cosens well talked with interviewer Bill McPhillips in our studio. Major Ben Dunkelman, company commander of the Queen's Own Rifles in the Battle of February 26th, and former trooper Don Chittenden, a member of Cosens' platoon.
Major Dunkelman, as you were the man in charge of this particular segment when Sergeant Cosens received his VC, perhaps we could begin the questioning with you and ask you, if you would, to set the general scene at the time of this particular battle.
Well, Bill, this action that we're interested in took place on the 26th of February, 1945. The Germans were very firmly entrenched in the last segments of the Siegfried Line. It's what we knew as the Schlieffen Line, just to the west of the Rhine and to the south of Emmerich. And our battalion was given the role of taking out the anchor positions in the Mooshof area that were covering the main anchor to cover the Kalkar-Udom Road. And we started off we were wakened around 3:30 that morning and given a shot of rum and told to move on.
A shot of rum. Now, as an old Navy man, I've got to stop you right there. I thought that was a naval tradition, not an Army tradition.
Well, I don't think that all the good things went to the Navy. We got a few of them in the infantry as well.
Well, I'm sure as we pursue this story, no one will begrudge you that shot of rum. What about the general conditions at that time? I'm thinking of weather. It was February, so they couldn't have been exactly ideal.
Well, as you know, that's the northern section of continental Europe, or I shouldn't say the northern section, but towards the north, and it's quite cold there. We'd undergone a very cold and rugged winter in the lines outside of Nijmegen, and it was still quite cold, although it was warming up a bit at this time. And as I recall it, the ground was quite muddy and quite hard going. The going was quite tough. And of course, we'd been in some bitter actions up until this time, and the men were fairly tired.
A little weary.
A little weary.
When you say you had been in some actions, your particular group now, is this a matter of days, weeks, or months that you'd been in battle?
Well, we'd been in battle actually steadily, practically since D-Day on June the 6th, when the battalion had landed with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, and we'd been in most of the action all the way through. We were an assault division, and we were used in these assaults.
Well, now, so much for the general scene, specifically now the man, Sergeant Cosens. Just what sort of a man is a fellow who wins the VC?
Well, it just so happens that Sergeant Cosens was a very unusual individual. I don't know if this always has to be the case of someone winning a VC, but Sergeant Aubrey Cosens was the kind of a person that would stand out in the crowd because of his forceful appearance. He was morally quite a character. He would stand out in the crowd. He had very strong features, and he was strong physically. We could always rely on Aubrey Cosens to carry an extra 40 pounds of ammunition or so and have them around when you needed them most.
He must have been a big fellow then. Well, now to Don Chittenden. Don, let's just establish exactly what your connection was with Sergeant Cosens.
Well, Bill, I was quite close to Sergeant Cosens often because I was Lieutenant McKay's second runner, and therefore I got to know him very well.
Now, can you give us, from your point of view, the battle as you saw it on that particular day, with special reference, if you can, to the actions of Sergeant Cosens himself?
Well, I would divide it in two phases. There was the initial assault on these fortified farmhouses, in which we got off fairly well until we got to them, and then our casualties mounted, particularly in a heavy artillery barrage, a very fierce barrage. And we actually weren't in the houses at the time. We were trying to dig in around to disperse. But before we had a chance, this terrific barrage came down on us because the Jerry's had the area taped beforehand.
Would your casualties at that time, Don, be fairly heavy in terms of men killed and wounded?
Not really until we got right on the objective, and of course when the artillery barrage came down, because we weren't dug in properly, didn't have time.
Well, now, as to sort of phase two, how did this go about, and what did the sergeant do?
Well, there was some infiltration by the Jerry's late in the heavy artillery barrage, and we had to go back in and clear the houses, and unfortunately we had very heavy casualties, and we had to do this again under very
sort of adverse conditions.
That's right. Thank you.
Well, now, Don, the way that a tank, I believe, became involved in this, did the sergeant sort of commandeer the tank, or what did he do in terms of making a hole, I think, in a barn?
Well, if I may go back a little earlier, Sergeant Cosens had said there were tanks in the area and would be bringing one up, but he brought the tank up and had to show the tank commander where a Spandau machine gun was set up because none of us could move. We were quite pinned down, even though it was fairly dark. And Cosens tried to communicate with the tank commander through the use of an outside phone on the tank, and that was of no use, so he exposed himself, but climbed up onto the tank and got behind the turret and pointed out to the tank commander the location of the Spandau. And with 2 shots from the cannon, the machine gun was silenced. Things were better for us after that for a little while.
And then the battle progressed from there, and you were able to take over this particular objective.
Yes, we got 14 or 16, I forget which, Germans out of one large building, which must have had a cellar, because otherwise I don't see any reason why they would have holed up in there. And we had an awful job getting them out of there. They thought they would be cut down when they came out, so Cosens, although we wanted to perhaps put grenades in there, not take a chance, Cosens talked us out of it, exposed himself in the doorway, and by talking and yelling to the Germans inside was able to gain their confidence into coming out and being taken.
Most unusual man. Now, he finally, of course, lost his life in this battle. Were you around at that particular
No,
juncture?
when these Germans were rooted out, there were quite a number of them. And actually, they probably outnumbered us by double. And they had to be disposed of. And Cosens appointed myself and Rifleman Norton to take them back. Yes.
And it was at that time that
It was
killed.
only minutes after, I believe, that he was killed.
We'll be back with the final chapter in the legend of Aubrey Cosens in just 60 seconds. There is little doubt that in the long history of the Queen's Own Rifles, February 26, 1945, will rank as the date on one of its finest achievements. The Victoria Cross awarded to Sergeant Cosens was both a tribute to the man and his battalion. Last year, officers and men of the 1st Battalion of the regiment serving in Germany with the regular army visited the scene of the action. For them, the road across the Rhine is peaceful, and the trip to Wimmershof filled only with the memories of those bloody days so long ago. At the Musha farmhouse where Sergeant Cosens fought so valiantly some 20 years before, the men of his battalion unveil a plaque to his memory. It reads, in commemoration of Sergeant Aubrey Cosens, V.C., 1st Battalion, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, who on the night of February 26, 1945, led the survivors of his platoon in the capture of these farm buildings, which were vital to the success of future operations of the 8th Infantry Brigade. For his gallantry, initiative, and determined leadership, Sergeant Cosens was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Later, at the Dutch town of Groesbeek, the latter-day members of the Queen's Own Rifles visit the final resting place of their fallen comrade to pay further tribute to his memory. The action in which Sergeant Cosens distinguished himself will be recorded by historians as a minor skirmish of the European campaign. Nor was he alone in fighting bravely and dying for his homeland. But 20 years later, it is perhaps significant that for the memory of a single comrade, a regiment returns to the battlefields of Holland and men gather in London to take part in a television program to honor him. Aubrey Cosens is not forgotten.